It was just a family portrait from 1952. 4 identical sisters, seated together, matching dresses, matching smiles. A photograph taken for a small-town newspaper feature on the town's famous quadruplets. For over 70 years, the photograph sat in a regional archive, occasionally reprinted, never examined closely. Everyone assumed they already knew the whole story. Then in 2024, a medical archivist in Ohio zoomed in on one detail. And what she found is the exact reason you're watching this video right now. Her name was Dr. Renata Voss. She specialized in mid-century medical research ethics, cataloging forgotten case files from state and university hospitals. She'd reviewed 6 photographs that week, connected to a research institution's old archive. This was the 7th. 4 identical faces, staring into the same camera, the same year, the same afternoon. Renata zoomed in on their eyes, checking image quality before archiving. Pure routine. Her hands stopped moving. Each sister's eyes showed the same faint, unusual ring pattern around the iris, a distinct marker Renata had only ever seen described in one place, a rare hereditary condition documented in a handful of confidential research papers from the 1950s. She had catalogued hundreds of mid-century medical photographs. She had never seen this pattern appear so clearly, in 4 sisters, in a photograph never flagged as medical documentation at all. This is not a story you've heard before. Historians who've since reviewed this case have said exactly the same thing, and by the end of this video you'll understand why. Why would 4 ordinary sisters, photographed for a small-town newspaper, carry a medical marker rare enough that almost no doctor in America would have recognized it? That question is what this story answers, and the answer reveals what an entire hospital chose to hide from 4 young women for the rest of their lives. Their names were Ruth, Alice, Dorothy, and June Calder. Born within 11 minutes of each other in 1938, in a small farming town in Ohio. Identical quadruplets were rare enough in 1938 to make national news. Photographers came from 3 states. Doctors traveled from as far as Chicago just to examine them as infants. Stay with this, because the reason those doctors kept coming back, year after year, is not the reason their parents were ever told. The Calder family farmed 40 acres of leased land, and the Depression years had left them, like most farming families in the region, with almost nothing set aside. 4 daughters at once meant 4 times the clothing, 4 times the schooling costs, 4 times everything a family budget in 1938 was never built to absorb. When Dr. Ashby's institution offered free specialist checkups for the sisters, framed as a rare research opportunity the family should feel fortunate to receive, the Calders had no real ability to question it. Free medical care, for 4 children at once, was not something a leasehold farming family could afford to turn down, whatever conditions came attached. This detail matters more than it seems right now. The Calders weren't simply trusting. They were financially unable to say no. The Calder sisters were, by every public account, an ordinary farming family's daughters, attending the local school, singing in the church choir, photographed for the newspaper every few years as a point of local pride. 4 identical faces, growing up together, inseparable. What their parents were never told, according to records Renata would later uncover, was that a research institution had identified, within the sisters' first year of life, a distinct hereditary eye condition, one so rare that fewer than a dozen documented cases existed anywhere in American medical literature at the time. Remember this detail. It's the reason 4 little girls became, without their knowledge, the most studied children in the state, and the reason their family could never afford to walk away, even if they'd suspected something was wrong. The condition itself was harmless in most respects, a subtle ring pattern in the iris, slightly heightened light sensitivity, nothing that affected the sisters' daily lives in any meaningful way. But its rarity, and its appearance in 4 genetically identical siblings, made it, to the researchers who identified it, something close to a scientific gift. Dr. Harold Ashby, the lead physician overseeing what began as routine childhood checkups, recognized quickly what he had access to, a natural experiment no laboratory could ever construct on purpose, offered to him by a family with no financial leverage to refuse continued access. The Calder parents believed their daughters were receiving free specialist care as a courtesy from a concerned local doctor. That belief, and their family's inability to pay for care any other way, is exactly what allowed everything that followed. Renata found the institution's internal funding records first. A research grant, renewed annually from 1939 through 1957, categorized simply as Longitudinal Pediatric Ophthalmology Study, subjects C1 through C4, 4 names, reduced to 4 letters and numbers. And not one word of it was ever shared with a family too financially dependent on that free care to ask too many questions. Renata's breakthrough came from the institution's internal case files, held in a university archive donated decades after Dr. Ashby's death. What she found there is the moment this story stopped being about eyesight and became something considerably darker. The annual checkups the Calder family believed were simple pediatric care were, according to Ashby's own case notes, considerably more extensive. Detailed vision testing, light exposure experiments. In several entries from the sisters' teenage years, extended examinations lasting most of a full day, always scheduled during school holidays so as not to draw attention. Ashby's notes describe the sisters, collectively, as an unrepeatable natural cohort, language a modern research ethics historian would immediately recognize as treating human children as scientific instruments rather than patients. This is the moment the system failed the Calder sisters, quietly, for 18 years, while their family believed they were simply lucky to have such attentive care they could never otherwise have afforded. Renata found something else in the case files that unsettled her more than the examinations themselves, a series of internal memos, dated throughout the early 1950s, in which Ashby explicitly discussed withholding a full diagnosis from the family, and explicitly noted the family's financial situation as a reason the arrangement was safe to continue. One memo, dated 1951, read, "Full disclosure risks losing access to the subjects, as parents may seek alternative care or decline further participation. Families' limited means make continued informal arrangement unlikely to be challenged. Recommend continued framing as routine specialist checkups." A doctor calculated, in writing, that a poor family's inability to pay for care elsewhere made it safe to keep them in the dark. 4 little girls' medical reality was hidden from their own parents, not out of caution, but to keep them available for study, and their family's poverty made that silence easy to maintain. By the time the sisters reached adulthood, each had developed a mild but persistent light sensitivity that occasionally caused headaches, eye strain, and difficulty in bright environments, a condition Ashby's own notes confirm he understood completely, and never once fully explained to the women experiencing it. Renata found a single letter, tucked into the back of the file, written by Ruth Calder in 1957, addressed to Ashby directly. It read, in part, "I have asked you 3 times now what is wrong with our eyes, and 3 times you have told me not to worry. I am 20 years old. I would like the truth. My family cannot afford to see anyone else, so I am asking you." She never received a written answer. That silence is the reason this story exists at all, and you're going to hear her words again before this video ends. Ashby's institution closed its research program in 1958, according to funding records, the same year the sisters turned 20. What happened next is the moment that should have finally given the Calder sisters answers. It didn't. The final case file entry, written by Ashby himself, notes simply that the study had reached natural conclusion, subjects aging out of useful pediatric adjacent data window. No mention of informing the family. No mention of explaining, even now, what 18 years of testing had actually determined. The sisters were sent a brief, generic letter thanking them for their continued cooperation with Dr. Ashby's ophthalmology practice, language carefully worded to suggest ordinary medical care rather than an 18-year research study conducted without informed consent. 4 women who had spent their entire childhood and adolescence being studied were dismissed with a single vague paragraph, and never told a single specific fact about their own condition. Renata found Ashby's published academic papers from this period, 3 studies, all describing 4 related female subjects with a rare hereditary ophthalmic marker, all published without names, all crediting the research entirely to Ashby's own clinical insight. The papers made Ashby a recognized name in a small, specialized corner of ophthalmology research. They cited no informed consent process. They acknowledged no family cooperation beyond a single line thanking the subject's guardians for their patience. He built a career on 4 sisters' bodies, and never once let them read what he'd written about them. The Calder sisters caught a scientific phenomenon so rare that a respected researcher built his entire professional reputation studying it, and none of them were ever told what, specifically, made them so valuable to him. If a story like the Calder sisters, 4 women studied for 18 years without ever being told the truth, deserves to be told properly, you know what to do. Renata didn't stop at Ashby's published papers. She began searching for any surviving Calder family records that might reveal what the sisters themselves eventually came to understand. What she found next is the piece of evidence that turned institutional neglect into something the sisters had quietly fought back against all along. She located a probate file connected to Dorothy Calder's estate, settled after her death in 1994. Attached, misfiled among unrelated property documents, was a small collection of personal papers Dorothy had kept sealed in a deposit box for decades. Renata's hands went still for the second time that week. Inside was Ruth's original 1957 letter to Ashby, the one demanding answers, along with something none of the sisters had ever mentioned publicly. A second letter, written by all four sisters jointly in 1961, addressed to the State Medical Licensing Board. "We believe Dr. Ashby withheld a full diagnosis from us and our parents for his own professional benefit," the letter read. "We are requesting our complete medical files, which have never been shared with us despite 18 years of examinations." Renata contacted a medical ethics historian, Dr. Samuel Klein, who reviewed the letter's outcome. He found the board's response in a separate archive, a single paragraph, dated 1962, declining to pursue the complaint due to insufficient evidence of clinical wrongdoing and Ashby's strong professional standing within the ophthalmology community. "They fought for their own answers, formally, through the correct legal channel," Dr. Klein said, "and the system protected the man with the reputation instead of the four women who actually lived the experience. Four sisters, in 1961, tried exactly the right thing. The system chose the famous doctor over them anyway." Dr. Klein and Renata assumed, initially, that the sisters' 1961 complaint marked the end of their search for answers. They were wrong. What they found next is the twist that turned this from one family's overlooked injustice into something far larger than either of them expected. Buried in the same deposit box was a third document, a private letter, written by June Calder in 1979, addressed to a younger researcher who had reached out asking to study the sisters again, decades after Ashby's original work had ended. June's response, carbon-copied and kept for her own records, was direct. She provided the researcher with her sister's full informal medical history, assembled themselves, over years, through outside doctors they'd sought privately, without Ashby's cooperation or knowledge. The sisters had spent their adult lives quietly rebuilding the exact medical understanding Ashby had refused to give them, piece by piece, on their own, with no institutional help at all. "This wasn't four passive women accepting what happened to them," Dr. Klein said, reviewing June's letter. "This was four women conducting their own informal medical investigation for over 20 years, entirely outside the system that had failed them." Renata found that June's 1979 correspondence had in fact quietly informed a small but significant shift in academic understanding of the sisters' condition, cited, unnamed, in two later medical papers as coming from informal patient-compiled history, source undisclosed. Two more papers, built, in part, on the sisters' own decades of self-directed research, still never crediting them by name. If you thought this story was already remarkable, this is the moment historians realized it was so much bigger than anyone initially understood. Renata and Dr. Klein published their findings in early 2025 through a medical ethics history journal, presenting Ashby's internal memos, the sisters' 1961 complaint, and June's later correspondence side by side for the first time. The response split almost exactly the way this story has split from the beginning. Medical ethics historians called it one of the clearest documented cases of consent violation in mid-century pediatric research, made unusually vivid by the sisters' own persistent, decades-long efforts to reclaim their own medical narrative. Some clinical historians urged caution, noting that mid-century research ethics standards were, by modern measures, generally poor across the field, and Ashby's conduct, however troubling, was not unusual for his era. But even the most cautious voices agreed on one point. Withholding a direct answer from a 20-year-old woman asking a direct question about her own body is difficult to excuse under any era's standards. The story reached a woman named Patricia Ellery, living in Columbus, Alice Calder's daughter, 6 weeks after publication. "My mother rarely talked about the study years," Patricia wrote in her first message to Renata. "She said only that she and her sisters learned, very young, that some people would only ever see them as data. She said it shaped how careful she was, her whole life, about who she trusted with the truth about her body." Patricia brought forward a small box of her mother's belongings, including something neither Renata nor Dr. Klein expected to still exist. Inside was a fourth document, a joint statement, written by all four sisters together in 1985, never sent anywhere, apparently intended only for themselves. One line read, "We have made certain the truth does not disappear completely. Whatever they called us in their papers, we know exactly who we were." That line is about to matter more than you think, because you're going to hear it again before this story ends. Dr. Klein, reading further into the sisters' 1985 joint statement, found a passage that reframed everything about how the four women had spent their later lives. What he found next is the detail that turned this from a story of institutional failure into something genuinely remarkable. The statement described, in plain and careful language, a decision the sisters had made together decades earlier, to compile their own complete, private medical history, session by session, doctor by doctor, entirely outside any institution that might once again reduce them to research subjects. "We have made certain the truth does not disappear completely," the statement repeated, word for word the same sentence June had first used in a separate letter 6 years earlier. Renata found the same exact phrase a third time, in a card Dorothy had kept from a family gathering in 1990, written in Ruth's handwriting for what appears to have been the sisters' final joint reunion before Ruth's death that year. 3 times, across 3 decades, in 3 different documents, the same sentence, not written by accident. Written because they needed each other to remember it was still true. Dr. Klein has said this repetition is the detail that convinces him the sisters understood, with total clarity, exactly what had been taken from them. Not their health, which remained largely unaffected, but their right to their own medical story, and their right to have been asked before becoming someone else's career. They weren't hoping for recognition, Dr. Klein said. They were making sure that if the truth ever needed 4 witnesses, it would have them, even if those witnesses were only sisters, writing to each other in private. The Calder sisters' individual death certificates list their occupations plainly: homemaker, school teacher, church volunteer. No mention of the 18 years of research, no mention of the 1961 complaint, no mention of the quiet, decades-long project of reclaiming their own medical truth from a system that had refused to hand it over. Patricia Ellery attended a small exhibition Renata and Dr. Klein helped arrange in 2025, displaying Ashby's internal memos, the sisters' 1961 complaint, and the original 1952 newspaper photograph, side by side for the first time in over 70 years. What happened at that exhibition is the moment this story stopped being only about the past. Patricia stood in front of the display for a long time before speaking to the small crowd gathered that afternoon. "My mother and her sisters spent 3 decades writing the same sentence to each other," she said. "We have made certain the truth does not disappear completely." They weren't asking anyone to believe them while they were alive. They were just making sure someone eventually would. The medical archive that now holds the sisters' documents has added a careful note beneath the display, not a claim of absolute certainty, but an honest account of what the evidence shows. It reads, in part, "Internal institutional records confirm withheld diagnosis and undisclosed research purpose spanning 1939 to 1958. The full extent of the impact on the Calder sisters' understanding of their own condition remains, by its nature, difficult to fully measure." Renata has said, in interviews since, that this case changed how she approaches every mid-century pediatric research file she encounters now. "We used to assume incomplete family records simply meant incomplete record-keeping," she said. "Now I think, sometimes, the incompleteness is the point." Someone decided 4 women didn't need the full truth about their own bodies, and for 70 years we all just accepted that as ordinary medical history. Look at the photograph one final time. 4 identical sisters, seated together, matching dresses, matching smiles. It looks almost exactly the way it did before this story began, but you will never see it the same way again. Renata, examining the photograph one last time at full resolution, noticed something she'd missed on every previous pass. All 4 sisters were looking directly at the camera, eyes wide open, entirely unguarded. The exact detail that had let a rare hereditary marker sit visible in a small-town newspaper photograph for 70 years without a single person recognizing what it actually meant. A photograph meant to celebrate 4 ordinary sisters had, without anyone realizing it, quietly preserved the one detail an entire research institution had spent 18 years trying to keep hidden from them. Ruth, Alice, Dorothy, and June Calder never received a formal apology, never saw their names attached, in their own lifetimes, to a single one of the academic papers built from their childhoods, never received the complete medical file they formally requested in 1961, through the correct legal channel, from a board that chose a famous doctor's reputation over 4 young women's direct question. But they made absolutely certain that one day, someone would look closely enough to find the truth, and today, you are the reason that promise was finally kept. We have made certain the truth does not disappear completely. They wrote that sentence together, at least 3 times, across more than 30 years, trusting nothing but each other and a handful of private letters to keep their word. What would you have done, in their position, reduced to 4 letters and a number, in your own doctor's private files, for 18 years of your own childhood, if stories like the Calder sisters, the ones institutions tried hardest to erase, deserve to be found and told properly. Subscribe, and let's keep looking closely at the truths we were never meant to see.